these last few weeks, as we've read through the middle of the Gospel of Matthew, we've seen this back and forth between Jesus and the chief priests, the elders of the people, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. And at every turn, Jesus is able to silence his critics, which of course only angers them more. And Matthew, when we read him, is telling us Jesus does have the answers to the questions. But the leaders are just too arrogant and too prideful to realize that. Now, we shouldn't be too hard on them because we ourselves often act just like them. How often do we say, with something we don't understand, particularly the teachings of the church or the scriptures, well, I don't get it. I don't agree with that. We have to be careful when we do so because there's lots of wisdom in the teachings of the church, and we turn our backs on them to our peril. So we come to this final question that the Pharisees asked Jesus, which is the greatest commandment? The next time we'll see them asking Jesus questions will be at his trial before the Sanhedrin. But in this little story, Jesus gives a very traditional answer. Greatest commandments: first, you shall love the Lord your God. Second, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. They were safe answers. No one quarreled with him. Everyone agreed with him. There was a great debate in Judaism over as to which commandment was the greatest. There were 613 laws that the faithful Jew had to follow. And so asking what was the greatest tended to try to prioritize all those commandments. But as we know from elsewhere in the scriptures, if we say we love God but hate our neighbor, as the first letter of John tells us, we are liars. And if we love our neighbor without loving God, our love is self-seeking, and it's usually very manipulative. By the end of the gospel, Matthew will show us precisely how Jesus perfectly fulfills this dual commandment of love of God and love of neighbor. He embraces completely God's will for his life by accepting the cross. But he does it on behalf of the rest of us, love of God and love of neighbor, the perfect love of God and neighbor. But of course, the question for us is, how do we love God and how do we love our neighbor at the same time? You know, anytime you really want an answer to that question, just look to the saints. They are examples of how to do both, how to love God and how to love neighbor. Think of all the great variety of saints that we have in the church. Think of a Mother Teresa or a Father Damien or a St. John Paul II. People who truly loved God but loved their neighbor as well. So I think it's worth taking time this morning to look at one person who really demonstrates to us that process of how we go about loving God and our neighbor. You know, we don't start off perfectly doing that, but if we're open to God, he will guide us in a variety of ways and provide us the opportunities to demonstrate both our love for God as well as our love for neighbor. And so, Rose Hawthorne was born in the early 1850s. She was the third child of the famous American writer Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote things such as The Scarlet Letter, The House of the Seven Gables, and many others. And so Rose was born into a privileged white Protestant family. She had a good home, she had good opportunities, she traveled in good circles. Later, her father would become a U.S. diplomat, and he would move the family over to England, where he was the U.S. consul in Liverpool. And of course, there she got to see London, she got to see Paris, she got to see Rome, where she even met Pope Pius IX. But at 13 years of age, her father died, and a few years later, her mother died. So as a teenager, she found herself very abandoned and very alone. And she experienced what she called a deep sadness. She became adrift. And as she began this dark period of her life, she also showed a lot of interest in Catholicism. and her spiritual life began to be formed and shaped slowly over time. Then at 20 years old, Rose married, and she had a son, but tragically, as was often the case in the 19th century before medicine had reached our level of sophistication, her son died at 4 years old. And it set Rose back again into that deep, dark sadness, a sadness beyond words, as she called it. And then her husband's alcoholism began to take hold, caused lots of problems in their marriage, and their marriage fell on hard times. So think about it. Here's a woman who had a pretty sophisticated background, a very famous father, and yet by her early 20s, she had endured some really dark moments: loss of parents, loss of a child, and a very difficult marriage. And at this point, her spiritual life begins to deepen, and her relationship with God becomes much more prominent in her life. But from experience, we know that's how often it works. We find ourselves in darkness, we find ourselves right on the edge. It's then that we are fully open to what God has in store for us. And at this point in her life, this miserable period of darkness and sadness and grief, something happened that was really a turning point and changed her life. She was living in New York City, and she read a story about a woman who was a seamstress and who was rather well off. And she was diagnosed with cancer. And the doctors declared that she was terminal. And so she exhausted all her resources trying to find a cure, but found none. And she eventually became so desperate and destitute that she was eventually exiled to an out-of-the-way place for cancer victims. Remember, back in the 19th century, cancer was looked at as a very dangerous and a very contagious disease. So people tended to be abandoned and isolated. They tended to be quarantined and marginalized. Well, she read that story, it touched her heart, and then she got down on her knees and she begged God, "Lord, show me the way to do something to help these people. Help me to help them." Simple, honest prayer. It shows the connection between the two great commandments. She got down on her knees out of love for God. And the second commandment, to love our neighbor, she prayed, "Oh Lord, show me the way to help these people in their need." And so, inspired by that experience, what did she do? Well, she realized she had no training as to deal with cancer. So she signed up for a training course at a hospital for cancer patients. And there she meets a woman named Mary Watson. Mary Watson had advanced cancer in her face, and the cancer had eaten away the central portion of her face. And the nurses had to change her bandages daily, and even the most experienced nurses found it very repulsive to do so. And Rose went into the room, and the ravages of the woman's cancer didn't repel her. In fact, it inspired her. And she knew at that point she was being called to care for cancer patients. And so after she finished her training, she rented a small apartment in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which in those days was pretty poor and pretty destitute. And she decided to take care of cancer patients by bringing them into her home and caring for them until she died. And remember, again, she was a woman of sophistication. She was used to the finer things in life. And now her whole day was spent in a poor neighborhood caring for cancer patients who were quarantined and isolated. And in time, people from all over New York came to Rose's apartment, those who were neglected by their families and abandoned by the hospital system. And as always happens when God's work is being done, volunteers came like bees to a flower to help Rose. So nurses, aides, and volunteers all came to help her. Eventually, her husband died of alcoholism, and this allowed Rose to pursue one of her dreams, to become a religious sister. So she and a few of the other volunteers in her home joined the Dominican Sisters, and she became a nun. Afterwards, she got enough funds to build a larger building to house the cancer patients, and she continued to serve them and care for them until they died. Eventually, through the help of many donors, she was able to build even a larger hospital, and in time, she and a few others formed their own branch of the Dominican Sisters, devoted purely to caring for those who were the sickest. And today they're known as the Hawthorne Dominicans. They're still around. They are the spiritual descendants of this great woman. Rose eventually died in 1926 at the age of 75. And today she's being considered for canonization in the church. There's one final detail. Towards the end of Rose's life, a biography appeared about her, which the information that I just gave you came from. And that biography was read by another young woman in New York City who was at a crossroads in her life, trying to find direction, trying to find spiritual meaning. And she read the story of Rose Hawthorne, and it inspired this young woman. And this young woman's name was Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. And she found that it was her job to care for the victims of society, the poor and the disenfranchised, the marginalized. You see, that's how saints are. They're like a fire and they catch here and there. Rose Hawthorne's life became a fire for Dorothy Day's life. And now that we've heard the story as well, hopefully it will become a fire for your life. Because Rose shows us these two great commandments, how they come together in Jesus. She got down on her knees and prayed, "Lord, show me the way to help them." And the love of God eventually dovetails with the love of neighbor, simply because Jesus is both God and human. You can't love God without loving those in need. Think of love. Think of this great commandment of love of God and love of neighbor, and let it sink into your hearts. And hopefully, like Rose Hawthorne, like Dorothy Day, like all the saints, let it inspire you to do great things for God and His people.